Children of Blood and Bone is a 2018 young adult fantasy novel by Tomi Adeyemi. So, I actually have a history with this book. I don't believe I've mentioned it on this channel before, but I actually used to work at a bookstore. Without getting too specific about the length of time or the exact store that I worked at, I can tell you that I worked there when Children of Blood and Bone came out. While I was initially interested in the premise of the book, I had a bit of a bad taste in my mouth from the get-go. There are some books that come fresh off the delivery truck smelling like AstroTurf, and this was kind of one of them. We were being pushed to market it to customers as the next Harry Potter. I would almost say that the author may have gone on like a late night show or something like that, and I think that might have been where the "it's the next Harry Potter" thing came from. So we were being encouraged to use that marketing point. Now, I am firmly of the belief that this is a poor marketing strategy. Publishers and booksellers don't decide what the next literary phenomenon is, the audience does. I can yap until I am blue in the face, but I can't spin a book into the next Harry Potter. No one can. That's an organic process that happens as the result of passion on the fans' part, true love and excitement for a story. Probably the only things that have come closest to Harry Potter's level of fame are Fourth Wing and ACOTAR. Then there was the Nora Roberts incident. For those of you with no familiarity with this drama, the short version is this. Tomi Adeyemi accused romance and mystery author Nora Roberts of plagiarizing the title of her book. Adeyemi's was Children of Blood and Bone, and Nora Roberts' title for her book was Of Blood and Bone. Very similar, yeah, except that Nora Roberts' book had that title for about a year before Tomi Adeyemi's, apparently. It was published after Adeyemi's, but it had that name long before hers was released. You also can't trademark or copyright a book title, so, womp womp. Suffice to say that neither of these things put a good taste in my mouth. I played with the idea of renting the book from the library, but I just didn't care enough to put in the effort. It's like, I think it's like 504 pages, something like that, so it would be a lot to commit to on a whim. Fast forward, it's 7 years later, I've acquired myself a job in which I am able to listen to music and such for pretty much all of my shift. Yeah, you wish you were me. So, I've got time to burn and loads of audiobooks available from my local library, so I start flipping through my options and, oh, well, look at that. Children of Blood and Bone is available at a whopping 17 hours of listening time. Yeah, I know, nothing compared to the 45 hours of Stephen King's It, but still 2 shifts worth of listening even if I put it on double speed. But time had passed, and I figured, hey, why not? It's supposedly set in kind of fantasy Nigeria, I guess, so it's a setting I don't see in every fantasy novel. Maybe it's a perfectly good fantasy story despite the author's little controversy there, and maybe I'll enjoy it or at least say, meh, well enough at the end. So, how did I ultimately feel about Children of Blood and Bone? To recap, the story surrounds 4 characters. Zélie, her brother Zane, Princess Amari, and her brother Prince Inan. Amari and Inan's father, the king, Saran, wiped out all of the Magi, people gifted with powers from the gods in the land of Orisha. You got Reapers who can commune and control the dead. You have Connectors who can communicate and connect with people through their minds and dreams. Burners who can use fire. Winders who can use wind. Tiders control water. Tamers control beasts. Lighters control light and dark. Seers control the past and future. Grounders control earth. Welders control metal. Healers heal. And Cancers spread disease. Not cancer necessarily, just disease in general. I feel like Infector would have fit the naming scheme whilst not being so specific, but whatever. Zélie and Zane's mother was one of the victims of the king's attempt to wipe out all magic in the land. He basically had all the known magi rounded up and murdered all in one night. Zélie and the other children who hadn't manifested their powers yet, referred to as diviners, were spared. It is generally believed that the king killed magic that night and that it is gone forever. Cut to the modern day, Zélie is, I want to say, 16, 17, give or take, and she's being covertly trained in combat with several other young women by Mama Agba, who is later revealed to have once been a seer and narrowly avoided being killed thanks to her gift. The king imposes massively unfair taxes, hence why Zélie convinces her father and brother that she should go to the capital to sell a rare fish that they caught, because she can charge a noble way more than a regular person. So Zélie and Zane go off to the capital. At the same time, Princess Amari sneaks away from a dinner to find her maid and best friend Binta, a diviner. What Amari eventually finds is her father, who executes Binta after a magic scroll in his possession causes her to regain her magic. Horrified at her friend's death and bewildered at the sight of magic, Amari ends up stealing the scroll and running off. She encounters Zayli as she's being pursued by guards throughout the city, and Zayli and Zane help her escape from the king's forces headed by Amari's brother Inan, who accidentally comes into contact with the scroll. When they find out Amari is the princess, Zayli is pissed because, understandably, she hates the king and the monarchy for taking her mom away. Zane gets her to back off, and they retreat to their village with Amari. Mama Agba reveals the scroll Amari stole has the power to reignite a diviner's magic, and, we later find out, has the power to give powers to people who touch it sometimes. Not always, though. Hence why Amari touched the scroll and is still normal, but her brother Inan has become a connector magi. Henceforth, he is able to track Zayli through the, and I quote, sea salt scent of her soul. Put a pin in that, I'm getting back to it. Inan comes to Zayli and Zane's village to retrieve his sister and kill anyone who's witnessed the scroll's power at his father's behest. Our protagonists escape with instructions from Mama Agba on where to go next, that being the Temple of the Magi in the jungle. There they meet a priest named Lekan. I heard the name pronounced, and now that I'm looking at it in my notes, I'm forgetting exactly how they pronounced it. But anyway, Lekan, he proceeds to dump the world lore on us once they get to the temple. A quick aside here, this scene reads very much like it was written with a movie in mind. It's kind of hard for me to describe this, but as Lakon was explaining all the magic and how the gods create the magi, the descriptions that I was given felt a lot like... It felt like something that would translate a lot better in visual media with flashbacks and visuals and whatnot. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Anyway, Lakon says they have to gather some more items and do a ritual by the solstice or magic will be gone forever. Inan and a lady named Admiral Kaya come and they gank Lakon as our protagonists escape. Initially, Kaya, who is also the king's one true love apparently, ends up finding out that Inan's a magi, they fight, and Inan accidentally kills her with his magic. Then our protagonists are off to the desert to get the Sunstone MacGuffin, which they then have to compete in a ship battle held in a flooded coliseum, which was an actual thing that the Romans did, by the way. Gladiator 2 didn't come up with that shit all on its own. Of course, our protagonists win and they get the Sunstone. Now, a quick recap for the characters and their development. Zayli's bit is about learning to use her magic. Amari is learning to be stronger and also developing a sweet little crush on Zane, which is clearly reciprocated. Inan is struggling with his connector powers, and sporadically throughout this book, he connects with Zayli telepathically in kind of a mind palace, mind place. I don't know. It's a concept I've seen in other media. But eventually Inan catches up with them in real life and does battle with Zayli, and then the two abruptly have to team up with each other as their respective siblings are kidnapped by a group of diviners that live in the forest. Eventually, they had possession of the scroll before the king did, and so a bunch of them have had their powers reawakened. Unfortunately, and perhaps predictably, the king's men find them, launch an attack, and Zayli is captured. In the time between Zane and Amari getting kidnapped and Zayli being taken by the king's men, Inan goes through a whiplash back and forth about magic. I hate it. I'm a monster for having magic. I use it to kill my dad's girlfriend. Oh, wait, hang on. Hot magi girl's starting to win me over. Maybe magic isn't so bad. Oh, damn, wait. I just watched a diviner basically explode from the force of his magic and take out half an army. Magic is bad again. So he ends up going back with his father's men, effectively getting credit for capturing Zayli, who's tortured for information until Zane and Amari and some of Zane's sports buddies break her out. Unfortunately, Zayli's lost her ability to use magic, and it's only a few days until the solstice, so womp womp. They go to the island they have to go to anyway, with a mercenary named Rowan leading the way, and basically they get ambushed. The king kills Zayli and Zane's dad, who is captured for the purposes of muscling them into handing over the items they were going to use for the ritual. And her father's blood allows Zayli to access blood magic, with which she proceeds to rain hell down the heads of her enemies. The king finds out Inan's a magi and that he killed Admiral Kaya and stabs him. Then Amari kills her dad. Zayli completes the big ritual, dies, sees her dead mom, and wakes up to find that magic has been restored and Amari is now a magi. The end. So, let me see if this sounds familiar. Everyone lived in harmony until the evil king took over and hunted all the people with special powers down. You have an older brother and a younger sister living in a fishing village. Their mother is dead, murdered at the hands of the king's evil forces. Their father is still alive. One day, the brother and sister meet a stranger whose arrival in their lives causes them to go on an adventure to bring balance back to the world, along with a large creature companion that, if I recall correctly, is able to carry multiple people at once. I don't think I mentioned this. Zayli has a pet, Leonaire named Nyla. who comes with them on their journey. But after this, what ensues is several very episodic adventures, one of which involves a temple and a deadline involving a solstice. Oh, and also they're being hunted by an angry prince determined to make his father proud of him, who nonetheless is conflicted about his duties and sways back and forth between good and evil. Yeah. Also, here's part of the summary. Zélie Adebola remembers when the soil of Orisha hummed with magic. Burners ignited flames, tiders beckoned waves, and Zélie's Reaper Mother summoned forth souls. But everything changed the night magic disappeared. Under the orders of a ruthless king, Magi were killed, leaving Zélie without a mother and her people without hope. Apparently, one of Tomi Adeyemi's inspirations for the book was Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it's very apparent in the story. I did not know that it was one of her inspirations when I started reading the book, but as I started reading it, I'm like, hang on, this sounds familiar. It's not a criticism, just stating my opinion here. It's very, very apparent that this book is inspired by Avatar: The Last Airbender. I strongly suspect that the author ships Zutara, but that's neither here nor there. In my opinion, Children of Blood and Bone pays homage to Avatar: The Last Airbender, but it doesn't rip it off. It shares some overarching themes and character roles. There's some similarities in the world building, but ultimately Children of Blood and Bone stands on its own 2 feet as its own unique story. Similarities between media are fine so long as they aren't excessive. In my opinion, there's a resemblance to Avatar: The Last Airbender here, but it's not a ripoff. I'm struggling a little bit here to decide how I feel about the writing, and that's probably because this is one of those ones I read as an audiobook. It's a little harder for me to tell if the writing is stilted or poor when I'm listening to it rather than when I'm looking at it, because sometimes narrators naturally smooth over awkward sentence structure when they're narrating. One thing I can say about the writing is that there is a lot of repetition. There were certain phrases that kept getting repeated over and over and over and over and over throughout the book. For example, duty before self, which is Anand's catchphrase that his father gave him. He also constantly refers to Zélie as having a sea salt soul or a sea salt scented soul over and over and over again. As long as we have magic, they'll never respect us was repeated at least 3 or 4 times. This is the kind of big realization that Zélie should have once, maybe twice, in a significant scene and moment, and then maybe lightly touch upon it afterwards. But I need to stress that this phrase and concept were repeated multiple times. If you say it once with feeling, you don't need to repeat the same thing multiple times. On the subject of magic, the phrase "bring magic back" was probably the one repeated the most. Duty before self was probably a second close contender. And I'm torn because on one hand, that is the point of this book, bringing back magic, and everything that happens in it is related to that. So some element of repetition is justified. But on the other hand, I feel like some very minimal tweaking to the wording and phrasing could have avoided the repetition altogether. The storytelling was interesting. I saw somewhere, I forget where exactly, I think it might have been Reddit, someone described this book as episodic, and having seen that Tomi Adeyemi did take inspiration from Avatar: The Last Airbender, I feel like that's where her story structure came from, too. So episode 1 would be the introduction of the main characters and setting off on the quest. Episode 2 would be them traveling through the jungle and finding Likan. Episode 3 would be the desert episode where they compete in the arena. Episode 4 would be the forest with the diviners. Episode 5 is Zélie getting captured and rescued. Episode 6 is the final bit where they try to do the ritual. They feel like episodes. It feels like we've completed one mini story and moved on to another one. And I'm not inherently against that in books. I mean, like, Harry Potter's getting an HBO miniseries adaptation because it can kind of work with that format. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I feel, wouldn't do too terribly with that format. Game of Thrones could work with it, etc., etc. There are plenty of books that happen to be formatted in such a way that they feel episodic. It's a you like it or you don't thing. I don't hate it, but I do have to question how much of the author's inspiration came from Avatar: The Last Airbender in terms of story formatting. Trying to write a book whose story is formatted the way a TV show's isn't necessarily a good idea. I also wonder if this might reflect Tomi Adeyemi's writing technique, because if she wrote these parts of the book separately across time, that might explain some of the repetition, but I don't know. It felt episodic, and I'm 50-50 on whether or not I like it. Okay. World building. Wasn't bad, but felt a little chaotic at times. We have a very big world with several different kinds of magi and diviners. Keeping track of all the different kinds was difficult. I will say that the episodic format does allow the author to hone in on different environments, so that's nice. Seaside, jungle, desert, forest. It was nice. Characters. Zaylee I went back and forth on. On one hand, I respect the fact that she's got big beef with the royals. She literally found her mother's body after they murdered her. I get it. At the same time, Amari is painted as being so sweet and accommodating that there are times when it really feels like Zaylee's kind of being a piece of shit to her. It pushed my tolerance for her, but I'll grant you her attitude towards Amari does improve eventually. Zaylee's relationship with her brother was nice, a little strained at times, but that's siblings for you. Her relationship with Inam was, again, very much giving off Zutara vibes. Enemies to lovers in a big way. I don't know that I'm convinced of any chemistry between Zaylee and Anan. Not in the way that I'm convinced of the chemistry between Zayn and Amari. I feel like it could use more development before I start believing them as a couple. Inan was a broken record, honestly. His thoughts pretty much exclusively revolved around pleasing his father and duty for self and lamenting the fact that he's infected with magic. Oh, and his forbidden attraction to Zaylee. If he was inspired by Zuko, I'd argue he pales in comparison in this book. Amari is a sweetheart. I liked her a lot, and I liked her character development over the course of the book as she got stronger and bolder. The hand-wringing and guilt over her father's actions kind of fell into the same repetition issue I mentioned above, but I can give some leeway on that given that she's been sheltered all her life and she's just now going out and seeing how bad things are. Zayn was nice enough, but I feel like his characterization was thinner. He's a strong, protective big brother with a crush on Amari. Also, he plays a sport, and I forget what it's called. Incidentally, he's the only one of the main 4 characters whose perspective isn't featured. I don't know if that's the author just couldn't get inside of his head or didn't think it would add anything to the plot, but I thought it was odd that he was left out. I feel like it could only have helped his character development if we'd seen a little inside his head. There were some other assorted characters, but most of them disappear once their episode is over. Some of them disappear because they're dead and, like, spoiler alert, their names get invoked in the next book, and it kind of falls flat. I don't know, I feel like Zaylee's dad was the only character whose death really made me sad, and I feel like that's less about him being a well-developed character that I liked, and more about the fact that I've lost a parent, and I can empathize with that experience. Overall, it wasn't a bad book, not the best, falls into a lot of the same issues you find in young adult books, but certainly not bad. Now, originally, this is where my review was going to end. I read the first book. It was whatever. I wasn't really passionate enough about the story to see what happened in the rest of the series. My intention was to be a bit more scant on plot details and not give away the ending since I didn't plan on covering the remaining 2 books. But then I noticed something interesting. There's a general rule of thumb on Goodreads. The first book in a series will usually have the lowest ratings in the series. It's the first book. It's the one that people start with. If they don't like it, they rate it accordingly and they don't bother with the rest of the series. Because of this, the remaining entries in a series usually get progressively higher ratings because the people reading them have already decided that they like this author, like their style, like their story, like their characters, so they're more likely to enjoy the sequels and rate them accordingly. Usually. So my curiosity was piqued when I realized that Children of Blood and Bone boasts the highest ratings in the Legacy of Orisha series at, as of this recording, 4.11 out of 5 stars. Children of Virtue and Vengeance, however, has a 3.89 rating, and Children of Anguish and Anarchy is 3.41, implying some seriously mixed ratings. Curious. The people who read books 2 and 3 clearly enjoyed book 1, or they wouldn't have bothered to pick them up. This strongly implies that Children of Blood and Bone's target audience, the ones who should be ripe to hand out top ratings to its sequels, were progressively displeased with them. Which further implies that there was a significant change in the writing, or some controversial storytelling or character choices that put readers off. So I actually decided to keep going on with the series and see for myself. Children of Virtue and Vengeance was published in 2019. The story picks up a little after the first one ended. Magic is back, wahoo, now what? Well, fuckery, that's what. See, now that magic's back, a lot of the Magi are ready for a heaping helping of revenge, and a rebel group forms to take out the monarchy. Queen Nahanda, Amari and Anan's mother, has developed massively outsized magical powers that involve her ability to suck powers from the Titans, who are nobles with magical ancestry that develop powers after magic returned. I am not joking when I say that Nahanda is borderline godlike in her abilities, which she then uses to kill almost everyone when Amari tries to seize the throne. So Zayli, Zane, and Amari join up with the rebels, who are led by Zayli's old teacher and Magi seer, Mama Agba. There are three major plot lines in this book. Zayli is torn between her responsibility to her people and her desire to be free from the pain and suffering that being their hero has brought her. She eventually ends up becoming the elder of the Reaper clan. She is still deeply, intensely furious at Inan's perceived betrayal. She believes that Inan was consciously involved in murdering her father, and counsels the Magi to engage in conflict rather than seek peace with the monarchy. She ends up getting into a romantic entanglement with Rowan, that mercenary who popped up towards the end of the last book. Inan, who survived being stabbed by his father, is now made king of Orisha. Out of affection to Zayli and an understanding of his father's legacy, he wants to seek peace and reconciliation with the Magi. He tries to be a moderating force, but between Zayli and his own people's rage and unwillingness to find peace, he's fighting an uphill battle. Inan nonetheless tries to restrain himself and his military from going the way of his father. Featured throughout the book is Inan's friendship with his cousin Ojore, a member of the military who's dedicated to protecting him. Amari is struggling with her new understanding of the evil her family has committed and wants to take the throne to create a better Orisha. The rebels do not respect her because she's a royal, even though she's a connector now, like Inan. She ends up becoming the elder of the Connector clan after fighting, and nearly killing, their original elder. Amari is very insistent on peace. Her attitude is that her mother is too powerful and they need to focus on reconciliation rather than revenge for the better sake of long-term success. She progressively becomes more frustrated by the Magi's unwillingness to listen to her, feeling that they're more focused on making the crown pay for what they've done rather than do what's best for everyone for the future. Things come to a head towards the end of the book. Amari manages to connect with Inan in the dreamscape, which is how he and Zayli met up a lot in the first book, and tells him where the Magi's hideout is so that he can come and talk peace. Zayli catches them together in the forest and is furious, but reluctantly decides to hear Inan out. Then the army attacks. Zayli and Amari are enraged, thinking that Inan set them up. He didn't. He's just as confused as they are. He told his cousin Ojore where he was going, and surprise, surprise, Ojore told Nahanda. The following attack results in a young Reaper named Mazeli, someone Zayli has gotten close to over the course of the book, dying, and that breaks Zayli's spirit, basically. So battle plans are drawn out. Amari, sick with guilt over the fact that she told Inan where to find them, is now convinced that her mother and brother are beyond redemption and need to die. She is so convinced of this that she hatches a secret plan with some of the Cancers. Again, hell of a name. I still feel like Infector would have worked just as effectively. The Magi go to attack Nahanda and Inan, who are holed up in Zayli and Zane's original hometown. Not the one on the ocean, but the one they lived in as children when their mom was still alive. The Magi try to slip in an attack, but they fall into a booby trap and a bunch of bombs go off. Zayli and Rowan survive, but this isn't immediately apparent. This is when Amari triggers her backup plan, which involves having the Cancers and the Winders send a wave of deadly gas throughout the entire village. Scorched earth, no survivors, her mother and brother have to die, so there's no choice. Except that Nahanda and Inan have already escaped, and all she succeeds in doing is killing a bunch of innocent civilians. Zayli manages to save many of them, but a bunch more die in the gas. Except that after she gets out, she and another Magi manage to bring most of them, pretty much all, I'm sorry, all of them, back to life. I forget exactly how they did it. I just remember rolling my eyes and thinking, okay, I'm gonna get into that in the analysis. Put a pin in it. We're coming back to it. So Amari's on the mega shit list now with everyone, especially Zane, who thinks Amari almost killed his sister, which is true. They end up doing a ritual to combine the Elder's powers so they can actually match Nahanda in power, which results in Mama Agba sacrificing herself. Back with Inan, Queen Nahanda reveals that she was the one who arranged for the Magi to attack the palace all those years ago. This, I don't think I mentioned it during my recap of Children in Blood and Bone, but this event is basically what kickstarted the king's desire to destroy magic, because his first family, his first wife and kids, were all wiped out in the massacre. This is basically the entire reason why he wants to kill all of the Magi, and it was Nahanda's fault. Incidentally, Cousin Ajore's family was also killed in this attack, and he finds out that Nahanda did it. So he ends up trying and failing to kill Inan in a fit of rage, and Nahanda ends up killing him instead. So now Inan's all like, all right, fuck it. No more monarchy. We suck too much. He drugs his mom and then goes to a banquet announcing that the monarchy is going to be dissolved. There's a big attack from the Magi. Fight, fight, fight. Punch, punch, punch. Zayli and Inan have a big standoff where she's about to kill him and he's going to let her. And then a big cloud of gas knocks them all out. When Zélie wakes up, she is in chains. She's in a boat on the ocean, which is where the book ends. I flagged a big difference between books 1 and 2 pretty quickly, and that's kind of the formatting of how it's written. As I mentioned before, Children of Blood and Bone is formatted in a sort of episodic way. It's a little tricky to describe, but the best way I can word it is that each set of events in the story feels kind of roped off into its own distinct little section. Like, I need to emphasize here that I have read a lot of books for kids, teens, and adults, and I don't usually come across books that read like this, or on the occasions that I do, it's not quite as distinct as it is in Children of Blood and Bone. Children of Virtue and Vengeance is a more traditionally formatted book in that the plot stays focused on one particular storyline the entire time. And that thread is effectively this ongoing conflict between the Magi and the Crown from Zélie, Amari, and Anand's perspectives. Still no Zane POV in this book, remember that. But instead of roping off the different issues in this book into their own little sections and kind of having them be their own unique little episode before we move on to an entirely new topic, the plot stays consistently focused the entire time. If my recap of Children of Virtue and Vengeance seems sparse, it's because it ultimately spends a lot of its time centered around those 3 major plot points. Zélie struggling to be a good magi, Mari struggling to be heard, and Anand struggling for peace. In many ways, the book suffers from some of that same repetition as the first, though not as much in phrasing as in concepts. The Magi aren't listening to me. I don't know if I'm right fit for an elder. Inan broke my heart. Inan can't be trusted, etc., etc. There weren't a lot of phrases that got repeated, but the concepts got revisited a lot. It's not atypical of YA novels to do stuff like this, but it's still not a good thing. It's better to go back through your writing and tweak some things, do a little rewording here and there, and try to make the point without stating it quite so bluntly multiple times. Another big change in this novel was the pivot from Zélie's relationship with Inan to her developing relationship with Rowan. Zélie just 100% hates Inan's ass and is constantly plagued by feelings of betrayal while simultaneously starting to cuddle up to Rowan. It's only towards the end of the book when she feels a bit more conflict about Inan and what he's done. I'll grant the author, she did a really good job, in my opinion, of establishing some good chemistry between Zélie and Rowan. I'm gonna talk more about this in my big analysis at the end, because what happens in book 3 really does make the whole love triangle thing just so much weirder, so much weirder. You spent all that time developing Rowan, and then book 3 happens. Amari's choice to gas the town was interesting. For most of this book, she has been, peace, 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 I can't kill my brother, we have to negotiate. Then she accidentally brings the army to the Magi's doorstep and is consumed with guilt and says, okay, cool, my brother and mother have to die, that's the only way this ends. Okay. I can understand how we've gotten to the point of Amari being willing to murder her mother and brother. It's the murdering hundreds of innocent civilians to do it part that has me cocking my head a little bit. I feel like we got close to this conclusion, but there's still a gap between the Amari who's decided her mom and brother have to die, and the Amari who's willing to drop World War I style mustard gas on an entire town to do it. I feel like the author brought us close to that final form of Amari. She didn't quite get us there, so there's kind of this dissonance between, I see that you were trying to lead me here, but I just don't think you got me to the finish line. What's more, I found it interesting how hard the narrative focused on Amari's culpability for this. Like, yes, she is culpable. It was her plan, but she wasn't the one who actually did it. It was Amani, a Cancer, and Jahi, a Winder, that actually carried it out. They actively agreed with and cooperated with her plan, but that I recall, Amari's the one who takes all the blame for it in the book. I could be wrong. I could be absolutely wrong. But I also don't recall the narrative explaining this. Like, for example, Amari's taking all the blame because she's a royal, and Jahi and Amani get to walk away scot-free because they're magi and everyone likes them. I don't think they were even really mentioned after the attack. It was treated as being 100% Amari's fault, which is weird because she physically could not have done this without them. She's not a Cancer and she's not a Winder. So, I told you to put a pin in the whole, the innocent civilians Amari murdered get resurrected by Zélie and another lady, I forget her name, and I don't really care. But they basically just go around and resurrect everyone, and it's just, really? Like, first of all, The way it's carried off feels so rushed and inconsequential. You just found out that you can resurrect the dead, and it's like a blip on the radar before going away again. Second, this kind of felt, to me, like the author was maybe trying to remove some of the sting from Amari's actions. Like, okay, she murdered all those people, but they got better, right? I feel like it was the author's intention to rehabilitate and redeem Amari, and that becomes a lot harder when she's literally dropped a nuke on a nursery school in the hopes of killing 2 house spiders. And again, I need to mention here that if you really want to redeem Amari in some respect, emphasize the fact that while this was her plan, she literally could never have carried it out without the cooperation of Jahi and Amani. Make sure that while it's acknowledged that Amari is culpable for the attacks, she shares that culpability with them. She was not alone or unique in making this incredibly fucked up decision. Regardless, after this incident, Zane basically hates her, the Magi are pissed, Zaylee can barely stand to look at her, and Amari's now played into the stereotype of the ruthless, murderous royal the Magi already, believe the monarchy to be. I figured that this would be addressed in the 3rd book, and said, okay, good luck and Godspeed writing that redemption arc, we'll see how you do. What else? I feel like this book, suffered from a similar problem to the first one. In the first book, there are loads of characters, many of whom mostly disappear once their episode is over. In this book, we have loads of characters to keep track of, but we stay with them more over the course of the book. The problem with book 1's approach is that we have so little time with the extra characters that that they don't have time to breathe and become memorable and special. In book 2, we have more time with them, but there are so many characters competing for attention that they all kind of suffer a little bit. Children of Virtue and Vengeance had a lot of characters, half of whom I don't remember or care about, but it did definitely set up a few that I actually did care about. Mazeli was given enough screen time, metaphorically speaking, and personality that I did feel sad when he died. Same with Mama Agba. Her death was meaningful and emotional because I knew her in the first book and actually spent time with her in this one. She's effectively a surrogate mother to Zaylee, family as well as a teacher, and her willingness to sacrifice herself was a genuinely poignant and heartbreaking moment. It meant something because I spent enough time with her character to grow attached to her. On that note, I was glad to see more exploration of the different Magi. I get why we couldn't see it as much in the first book since magic was gone and therefore most Magi and Diviners don't have their powers anymore, but this book did go out of its way to explore the different clans. I don't think it was a deep exploration, but it was an exploration that I assumed would continue in depth in book 3. So, in short, if I'm venturing a guess as to the dip in ratings for Children of Virtue and Vengeance, I'm guessing it's a change up in the story structure, plot, less fantasy adventure, more fantasy war, and the flip from Zaylee and Anon being the main ship to Zaylee and Rowan. Which brings us to book 3. Children of Anguish and Anarchy was published in 2024 and is the conclusion to the Legacy of Orisha series. But like the first 2 books, I read this one as an audiobook, and when I pressed play and kind of half-heartedly listened to the audiobook introduction, I suddenly stopped what I was doing and rewinded because, hey, sorry, did you just say Cynthia Erivo was narrating this one? Holy shit, Cynthia Erivo is narrating this one. I am so curious as to whether or not this was before or after she was cast as General Kaya in the upcoming movie adaptation, but anyway. So we start out not exactly where we left off in book 2, but a little bit later. Zaylee's been on the ship for a few days at least. Also captured are Inan, Zane, and Amari, as well as a handful of other people whose names escape me. All of their Magi powers have been neutralized, so their ability to escape is badly hindered. This guy named King Baldir is trying to find 2 specific girls because of a prophecy. Basically, he's got to sacrifice these 2 girls so he can become a god. Naturally, Zaylee is one of the girls in question, and he basically fuses a medallion with her skin. There's a big rebellion on board, all of the captured Orishans capture the ship, but King Baldir has already escaped to another ship and taken off. Their ship ends up capsizing and everyone has to get onto lifeboats, which eventually end up on an island. Zaylee and Anon end up separated from the rest, they have a moment before withdrawing the others. Zaylee manages to restore everybody's neutralized powers somehow. I think the implication was that the medallion King Baldir fused to her skin was able to influence that somehow. And then there's some talking. The problem is that King Baldir has been taking Orishans for a while and will probably be coming back to Orisha for round 2, especially so he can nab Zaylee again. Inam wants to go get the Orishan military and Magi on alert. The Magi are obviously not happy with this, since Inan is the king, and as the last 2 books have established, They have issues with the monarchy, to put it lightly. Zayli, on the other hand, had a vision of the other girl that Baldier's targeting and wants to go find her and warn her of what's coming. So Anon goes back to Orisha with the Magi. He basically demands that the Magi and the monarchy put down arms and come together to fight the bigger threat, and... Listen, I'm not joking. I'm not fucking with you. We see this big scene of King Baldier's people coming down and wiping out both the Magi and the military, including Queen Nahanda, despite her being the big, bad, god-powered bitch of the last book. And then the scene ends, and it's revealed that Anon was just using his connector powers to show them what will happen if they don't come together. And so, of course, they do, with no further argument. We're coming back to it. We're coming back to it, all right? We're gonna get back to it. I still got a big analysis to do. Zayli, Zane, and Amari end up in a place called New Gaia, where Orisha is straight up fantasy Nigeria and King Baldier's homeland, if they named it, I don't remember, and I am long past caring, is meant to be kind of fantasy Scandinavia based off of the naming schemes. New Gaia is more like fantasy Central or South America. It's tricky to tell since, again, I listened to this rather than read it, but I'm half sure that I heard some Spanish being spoken by the New Gaians in the book. I could be entirely wrong, though. I'm much better at clocking this stuff when I can actually see the words rather than hear them being spoken. So Princess Mai is the other girl that Baldir wants. I could be misremembering the pronunciation of her name. So Mai has some special role or powers in her community, kind of like Zayli. So she, Zane, and Amari stick around in New Gaia for a bit. I'll get to this more later, but Amari basically ends up in a romantic relationship with Mai. At one point, King Jorah, Mai's father, effectively ends up saying to Zayli, okay, so we know where King Baldir is, let's go and sniff around a little bit. And they do, except unfortunately it would seem that the medallion King Baldir slapped into Zayli basically gives him the ability to channel her Reaper abilities, and he starts resurrecting his soldiers the second that they're cut down. I think they got back to New Gaia just fine, but there's now an understanding that their ability to fight King Baldir is scuffed. Now listen, I'm gonna have to confess here that the exact order of events is a bit lost to me, and frankly, I don't think it matters. I really don't. What eventually ends up happening is that Zayli and Mai are captured by King Baldir, who's ripe and ready to sacrifice them. If I recall correctly, they manage to escape, though Mai comes really close to dying. Then there's a big old battle at the end of the book, where, long story short, Zayli is the biggest girl boss ever to girl boss, and through the mighty realization of her godlike powers, she's able to wipe King Baldir off the map. Oh, and Anon dies. Remember when I said earlier that they pulled a Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2? Well, when he dies, it's more of a Star Wars Rise of Skywalker thing, where he literally gives her, like, the breath of life in a metaphysical sense. Kind of like what Kylo Ren did with Rey. So Zayli and everybody, they go back to Orisha. Yay, hallelujah, book over, bye. Where do I even start with this one? Holy shit, there's just so much. Alright, so let's talk about progression. Book 1 is an episodic fantasy adventure in a variety of different locations. Book 2 is a linear fantasy war story, and Book 3 is, I guess, a different fantasy war arc that was just all over the place. One difference I want to note up front is the sudden appearance of Zane's POV in this book. Previous 2 books, his POV was never shared, and now suddenly he's included. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, I'm just saying that it was a weird choice to go with the final book. I'm iffy on whether or not including Zane's POV was strictly necessary in this one, and given the length of the book, I'm almost tempted to suggest that it was put in to pad things out a little bit. If it is the case that his perspective was added for padding, that is wild, because this is the shortest book in this series. It's 368 pages compared to Book 1's 544 and Book 2's 404. And yet, somehow manages to completely scupper the plot from the first 2 books in favor of introducing a new villain that is barely present in the story. On that note, King Baldir is a limp noodle of a villain. He has no presence. I know almost nothing about him. He isn't scary. He isn't intimidating. I have barely any sense of his internal motivations beyond I want to be a god. Book 1's villain, King Saran, I basically understood his motivations. Same with Queen Nahanda in Book 2. They're fighting to keep control of their country, and they view magic as dangerous and evil, and they want to maintain power over the population. Simple enough. Baldir, as a villain, is painfully thin, and that absolutely undermines the threat he supposedly poses to the main characters. Zaylee is much the same as she was in the first two books, but somehow, by the end, we've managed to make her even more ridiculously overpowered than she already was. There was no character development for Zaylee, and, in my opinion, no satisfying conclusion to her emotional journey throughout the trilogy, because we just dropped the entire heart of her conflict with the monarchy and the oppression of the Magi in this book. Inan, I'd have to go back and physically count how many chapters he had, and I shall not. But if I recall correctly, the majority of his role was getting Orisha to unify and then saving Zaylee at the end. His role in the plot was, I guess, technically important, but also very scarce. I feel like I didn't see him as much in this book as I did in the last two. Oh, and speaking of love interest, just tossing this out here. Rowan? The one book two spent so much time getting Zaylee to fall in love with and establish chemistry with, he is not appearing in this book. I think he was mentioned once or twice and then never again. I was genuinely blown away by his absence here after all the trouble the author went through to establish his chemistry with Zaylee in book two. Zane was there. As I said before, I suspect he was added for padding, and honestly, I'm of the opinion that his perspective added little to the story. It could have, but in my opinion, very little would have been lost if it was cut. Amari was also there. I'd have to go back and count, kind of like with Inan, but I feel like she was less there than she was in the previous two books. Remember the whole I slaughtered a bunch of people that Zaylee and another lady then brought back to life thing? Yeah, it comes up a few times in this book, but more or less it's forgotten. It's kind of a blip on the radar and then it's gone. No real consequences, no nothing. While I'm on the subject of Amari, let me cover the romance between her and Mai. This was certainly a choice, given how much time and effort was put into developing Zane and Amari's relationship in the first two books. I suspect that Tomi Adeyemi made this choice for two reasons. First, because rebuilding Amari and Zane's relationship would have taken time and effort that the author maybe didn't want to bother with. And two, so she could add LGBT representation, since I seem to recall a few people making noises about the fact that book one didn't have any LGBT characters in it. Book two had a blink and you'll miss a couple, if I recall correctly. And I think that the author's solution basically was to kill two birds with one stone. On the representation end of things, that's obviously the author's choice to make. It's her book, and she can make whatever creative choices she wants with it. However, for the record, I don't think that authors should bend to complaints about representation. You should write your book the way that you want to write it. If your cast is diverse, great. If it isn't, that's fine too. Nobody is owed anything, and if the audience is mad about it, well, they can go read something that satisfies them better, but you do not have to capitulate to them. Stay true to the story that you want to write. On the Amari Zane ship end of things, I think it's a bit of a cop-out to spend so much time building up these characters and their relationship across the last two books, only to just drop it in the last one. I feel like it would have been much more satisfying for the audience if the work was put into either bring Zane and Amari back together, or at least give their relationship a graceful, kind of falling out of love arc, instead of just, shoving Amari with a girl who's been here for 2 seconds. It's cheap, in my opinion. It's very cheap. Her relationship with Mai felt completely forced, and I didn't buy it. Something else about this book that felt completely forced was everything. I mean, think about it. The plot of the first two books centered around this massive conflict between the Magi and the monarchy. They hate each other and will go to extremes to wipe each other out. And then in the third book, all of that just gets sucked down the drain in the time it takes for Inan to scare them all with a vision. Where's the challenge? Inan's a connector and the king. The monarchy is pissed about the former, and the Magi hate him for the latter. Why is no one questioning what he's shown them? Inan doesn't recount a memory. He created an illusion in their heads of something that has not happened yet. Why is no one accusing him of falsifying the vision to manipulate them? Neither side has any reason to trust him, but they end up dropping everything once he shows them an illusion. It just doesn't track, is what I'm saying. One last thing that bugged me is that it felt like Children of Anguish and Anarchy went right back to being overly repetitive with its phrasing. I said in book 2 that it was more concepts that got repeated, and I feel like that may have happened in this one too, but this book went back to book 1's tendency of repeating specific phrases over and over and over again. Mai is mentioned so many times to have diamond eyes or a diamond gaze. Likewise, Amari's amber eyes are referenced ad nauseum. Zaylee's silver eyes are much the same. The phrase russet skin was used over and over, though I can't remember who it was referencing. Please, for the love of God, do not repeat descriptive character traits. Describe them once and then get it over with. Or if you want to emphasize a character's appearance in specific moments because it adds something to the scene, then you can mention their eye color. Then you can mention their hair color. But don't do it every other page. All right, I feel like I should move on to my overall analysis of the series at this point. In the first book, Zaylee was a young woman chomping at the bit to fight back against the monarchy, but also she was afraid of doing so because of what happened to her mother. She resents Amari for much of the book for no other reason than that Amari is a royal and her family is responsible for what happened. Over the course of the story, she struggles to develop her magical abilities and constantly questions whether or not she's up to the task of restoring magic. She pushes through, progressively becoming more confident. Zaylee also slowly begins to feel attraction towards Inan, her enemy, which gives her another complex. Towards the end of the book, after King Saran tortures her, she breaks down and loses her spark, effectively. Then she loses her father to King Saran at the end. In Book 2, we see the fallout from this. Zaylee is heartbroken and effectively in escape mode. She's in so much pain that she just wants to leave Orisha and everything else behind. Slowly, she starts to recover, but she's also darkly obsessed with taking out Inan, who she perceives as a traitor. She's closer with Amari, but they slowly grow apart over their differing attitudes on how to solve the conflict between the monarchy and the Magi. Towards the end of the book, this changes a little bit after she finds the gift and letters that Inan left for her. In Book 3, Zaylee is afraid of King Baldir. And not much else. I think part of the problem here is that her character development in the first two books was so tied into the plot and the overarching conflict between the Magi and the monarchy that taking her out of that situation without resolving it just leaves her characterization a bit lost in Book 3. In Book 1, Amari was a sweet but largely ignorant princess who wants to explore the world and do good. Once she goes on this adventure and starts to see how badly her family is screwed over the Magi, she's consumed with guilt. She struggles to make herself useful to Zaylee and Zane, and at the end of the book, she's forced to kill her father. Her entire thing is trying to become stronger. In Book 2, Amari is more confident. She's conflicted about her father and the fact that she has to kill him, but believing Inan is dead, she proceeds to make an attempt at claiming the throne. When that fails, she tries to fit into Magi society, but she struggles immensely with getting them to trust, respect, and listen to her, believing that going for peace is the best option over war. When she perceives her brother has betrayed her, she goes off the deep end and proceeds to enlist 2 other Magi to gas an entire town to ensure her mother and brother die. When it fails, she's filled with misery and regret. In Book 3, Amari is on the ship, and then she's not, and then she meets Mai. I don't recall Amari having any significant character arc in Book 3. I'm going to get into this when I analyze the story arcs overall, but Amari and much of the other characters in Book 3 are very in the moment. They're very focused on what's happening right now and not so much the past or anything else that's happened, which is kind of why any emotional or social consequences for Amari's actions at the end of Children of Virtue and Vengeance just kind of seems to go out the window. In Book 1, Inan was a prince who believed it was his duty to protect Orisha at all costs, especially personal costs. I swear I want to download the book just to control F how many times he said the phrase, duty before self. He has a major complex over being a Magi, initially, especially after he accidentally kills his father's admiral girlfriend. He also clearly wants to bang Zaylee, but initially can't reconcile wanting to be with a Magi. Until he does, and then is on board to bring magic back, but then he sees a burner self-immolate and wipe out a group of people, and he does a heel-face turn, saying, never mind, fuck magic. He reluctantly returns to his father, but is horrified to see that Zaylee has been tortured and facilitates her escape. He further participates in the kidnapping of her father, and is similarly horrified when he is killed on Saran's orders. He is then stabbed by his father after he realizes that Inan killed his secret girlfriend. In Book 2, Inan survives and becomes king of Orisha in a time of major upheaval and chaos. He immediately wants to fix the damage his father's done, but has to constantly balance his desire to help the Magi with his need to maintain support of the nobles and military. In Inan is constantly pulled in several different directions, that being his love for Zélie, his desire to be better than his father, and his need to play political games to stay in the good graces of his people. In Book 2, his cousin Ajori is a major source of support until they learn that Inan's mother engineered the massacre that killed King Saran's original family, as well as Ajori's parents. Then Inan's beloved friend and cousin turns and tries to kill him. Overwhelmed with guilt when Ajori is killed and at his mother's actions, Inan decides to dissolve the monarchy. He rebuilds some of Zélie's seaside home, leaves his letters to her, and basically says, if you want to kill me, I'll hold still and let you. In Book 3, Inan is properly freaked out that King Baldir's people are coming for Orisha. He hurries back home and reunites the Magi and the monarchy with relatively little difficulty. Then, at the end, he gives his life to save Zélie's. Zane is a loving brother in books 1, 2, and 3. He is steady and reliable and responsible. In the third book, he struggles with the corrupting bloodlust and power that comes with wielding one of the magic weapons from Baldir's people, but that's about it. If I'm looking at the character development overall, there's an obvious pattern here, namely that Book 3 is where it goes to die. Again, I'm going to get into this during the story arc analysis, but this book was very immediately focused on this book and not the previous events that led up to it. Everyone's focus is on stopping Baldir and what has to be done to achieve that, so their character development in relation to the original conflict that took up the first 2 books is sort of abandoned. On the romance front, the first book centers Zélie and Inan going from enemies to lovers and then back to enemies again. The second book features Zélie hating Inan's ass from afar and then falling in love with Rowan, and then at the end feeling some greater conflict and pain about her lingering feelings for Inan, suggesting that they might have a future together. And then in the third book, Rowan literally disappears. Entire story is Zélie and Inan focus. Zélie does not, that I recall, feel any conflict about her feelings for Inan despite falling in love with Rowan in Book 2. And that is just so jarring, because Book 2 really does seem to go out of its way to set up Rowan as the most viable alternative to Inan. Hell, again, I'd argue that the author establishes his chemistry with Zélie a lot better than she did with her chemistry with Inan. For people who were invested in Zélie and Inan, Book 2 must have been a real kick to the teeth. For those who weren't hot on Inan and liked Rowan better, Book 3 must have been a slap to the face. That Rowan was just not in Book 3 makes me wonder if Tomi Adeyemi got some splashback for having him be the new and ostensibly real love interest in Book 2, and maybe decided to reverse course for Book 3. If that's the case, it backfired because I've seen some posts made by some very unhappy Rowan-Zélie shippers. Put a pin in it. I'm actually going to tie this together. Book 1 has Amari and Zane falling very wholesomely in love with one another. They're both sweethearts. Zane is kind to Amari despite who she is. It's an easy pairing to fall in line with. Book 2 didn't develop them quite as much, but it did build on what was a solid foundation established in Book 1. Then at the ending, we get the gas attack, and Zane being furious over Amari nearly killing his sister, and actually killing dozens of others that got whoopsied back to life, I guess. So now we have a great setup for Book 3, right? How will the author handle this? Well, the answer is that she doesn't. Not really, anyway. She touches lightly on what Amari did in Book 2, but it's not lingered on. And then she shoves Amari off with Mai, and Zane approves without any consternation. It's like they were never romantically involved at all. Again, 2 books building up to this couple. Things get hairy at the end of the second, and then the third, it's all scuppered. If the author had shown Zane being sad that Amari was moving on, I would get it. If she had shown Amari being more conflicted about her feelings for Mai because she still loves Zane, I would have gotten that too. But nah. Instead, we get a rushed, here's a new pairing at the 11th hour, and I'm not really going to resolve anything between Zane and Amari. They just don't love each other anymore, and they're fine being friends. Bye. That was just so unsatisfying. I was not a fan of it. Again, I think I said this earlier, at least give them a graceful falling out of love period. Okay. Finally, now for the overall plot of the series. Book 1 centered on Zélie, Amari, and Zane going on episodic adventures to find the things they need to restore magic while being hunted by the monarchy. Very central to the plot is the oppression of the Magi by the monarchy. Book 2 centered around the fallout from magic's return. The Magi are fighting back, the monarchy has magic now too, and it's turning into a clusterfuck. Zélie wants war, Amari wants peace, Inan is torn between the two. Book 3 finds our heroes on a ship in the middle of the ocean with a brand new enemy that we've never heard of or had any awareness of before now. He has a plot that is pretty much completely disconnected from the previous 2 books. He wants to be a god. The only real connection is that he needs Zélie, the great and powerful, and Mai, another entirely new character from a place we didn't know existed before now. So I think I can figure out why book 3 has the lowest ratings. Not really a stumper. The dip in ratings for book 2, again, I think can be explained because of the transition from an adventure story to a war arc, as well as the change from Zaylee and Anon being the romantic focus to Zaylee and Rowan. I do wonder if the author might have gotten negative feedback about Anon and changed course, or if she originally intended to set up a love triangle that resolved itself in book 3, but just chopping Rowan from Anguish and Anarchy and having Zaylee only mention him once or twice was such a weird choice. I kept saying I'd come back to this, but something I noticed about in book 3 was that it felt very in the moment. The characters throw themselves into this new plot, and it's borderline like they've forgotten everything that happened in the first 2 books. Book 3 is 90 to 95% focused on the Baldir plot, and so everything else falls into line to fit that focus. Character development stagnates, the conflict between the Magi and the Monarchy is resolved super fast, we don't get further exploration of the multiple Magi clans, we don't get a satisfying resolution to any of the love stories, everything is focused on stopping King Baldir. And I think there's a reason for that. Remember when I brought up how no one questioned Inan's illusion of Baldir's people attacking? I get the vibe, and sincerely, this is just my opinion, I could be 100% wrong, that no one challenged Inan because the goal was not to properly finish or flesh out this story, it was to get the book to the finish line. This book feels rushed. It feels like Tomi Adeyemi might have had a contractual obligation to finish the series, and so she did. She wanted it done, and building a satisfying conclusion to the series that firmly connected back to the previous 2 books would have taken way more time and effort, so she conjured a new plot and a new enemy to focus on so she could get it out and be done with it. That is my theory. I could be wrong. But my evidence for this. We're not rebuilding Zane and Amari, or at least addressing what happened between them in a meaningful way, and again, giving them a graceful falling out of love arc, because that would take time. We're leaving Rowan out of this because bringing him in and developing his situation with Zaylee would take time. We're not going to build up Amari and Mai. We're not going to drag out this conflict between the Magi and the Monarchy. We're not going to go in depth with the characters and their development because all of that would take time, and I feel like the author just maybe didn't want to do that. Again, could be wrong. That's just my opinion. I obviously cannot know what is going on in the author's head or in her business dealings with her publisher, but book 3 is, in my opinion, riddled with what I view as evidence that she was checked out from the plot of the first 2 books and wanted to get this done and over with. Now, interestingly, Children of Blood and Bone has been optioned for a movie adaptation. It is supposed to come out in January of 2026. And there is some potential to do some correction in this adaptation. The movies have the benefit of knowing where the series is going and slipping references to King Baldir and New Gaia and all related topics in early on, so there could be a more graceful transition into this plot if Children of Anguish and Anarchy is ever adapted. But unless they've already optioned sequels, it'll probably depend on how well the movie adaptation of Children in Blood and Bone does in theaters. Apparently, it is being released in theaters, so if you're interested, keep an eye out. Woo! Oh, Jesus Christ, this was long. This actually might be my longest book review to date, but I guess that's what happens when you review 3 books at once. Overall, Children of Blood and Bone was a decent fantasy. Children of Virtue and Vengeance changes lanes and becomes an okay war arc. Children of Anguish and Anarchy is a completely different plot that ends up feeling slapdash compared to the previous 2 books. I'd recommend the first book and even the second book, but the third one, I don't know. Doesn't really satisfyingly clean up the series, so I guess I'd say just be aware of what you're getting into if you plan on reading it.